All right, everyone. I think let's slowly get started so we have plenty of time for our talk and questions afterwards. So welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to introduce the next speaker in our machine learning seminar series. And today we have Yichi Zhang here. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Computer Science and Statistics at the University of Rhode Island. He did his PhD in statistics at North Carolina State University and spent some years as a postdoc at the Harvard School of Public Health. And his research focuses on a, I think, particularly exciting and timely topic, which is decision-making and sequential causal inference with applications in biomedical problems. So really, it's all about explanations. And I think that's a super exciting topic that we all should be interested in. We'll have plenty of time budgeted for questions. Just put them in the chat and we'll answer them at the very end of the talk. And Yichi, please take it away. Stage is yours.
Thank you, Tazan, for the nice introduction. Today, I will give a talk on my work with a series based on a series of work with my PhD advisors, Eric, Butch, and Marie. And I would specifically talk about interpretable individualized treatment rules using decision list. I will first give an overview about what the precision medicine is and how we formulate a mathematical framework for precision medicine. And then I will introduce the concept of list-based rules and talk about how it could promote interpretability in precision medicine. And then I will move into the technical details about how we are going to use either data from either clinical trials or observational studies to estimate those list-based rules. And finally, I will conclude my talk with an illustration on a real data set and some discussion about the methods. It is quite common that we need to compare a new treatment to a standard treatment using either a randomized trials or an observational studies. And this is often a central topic in causal inference. Nowadays, many people started to realize that it is hard to find a new treatment that performs really well on the whole population. But even if the new treatment doesn't show much improvement, if we take the averaging over the whole population, it may still be beneficial to a subgroup of patients. A treatment might work for this group of patients but not for the other groups. Similarly, a treatment may work for the current period but not for a future period. So in those situations, we would like to tailor our treatment recommendation based on patient characteristics. So we want to move a step forward from a one-size-fits-all treatment to a personalized recommendation so that we are able to give the right treatment for the right patient at the right time. And that's the central focus of precision medicine. Mathematically, in precision medicine, we would like to develop an individualized treatment rule, which is also known as a treatment regime, which is a function that maps patient covariates to treatment options. For example, we could say that let's give male patients the new treatment and give female patients the standard treatment. Or we can say that give the younger patients a more aggressive treatment and give the elder patients a more conservative treatment. As a special case, we could consider a constant function that basically maps all the X to a single treatment. This is a special case in the sense that we are giving the same treatment to everyone, so there are no personalization at all. So in precision medicine, we are not saying that we always want to personalize, but we also include the possibility that after looking at the data and conducting analysis, we realize that we may want to conduct any personalization at all. As a motivating example, I would like to consider this little bit kind of old study conducted by the National Surgical Adjuvant Breast and Bowel Project. In 1977, they initiated a randomized clinical trial for women with primary operable breast cancer and positive axillary loads. And they have two treatments available after removing that breast cancer in a surgery. The patients may receive chemotherapy alone, or the patients may receive chemotherapy with tamoxifen. And tamoxifen is a drug that helps to prevent the recurrence of the cancer. But the tamoxifen may also have severe side effects. And in this study, 5 patient ovaries were measured: the age, the estrogen receptor level, the progesterone receptor level, the tumor size, and the number of histologically positive loads. The outcome of interest is 3-year disease-free survival. In this example, in the framework of precision medicine, an individualized treatment rule is a function that maps patient ovaries to one of the treatment options. So here, patient ovaries are the 5 ovaries: age, estrogen receptor level, progesterone receptor level, tumor size, and the number of histologically positive loads. So those are the input of the function, and the output of the function should be either chemotherapy alone or chemotherapy with tamoxifen. In this very early paper, Dell and Simon suggested an individualized treatment rule that give chemotherapy alone if the age of the patient is at most 50 years old and the progesterone receptor level is at most 10. And this rule was developed based on their domain knowledge. They make use of the domain knowledge to choose these 2. They believe that these 2 variables are the most important one out of the 5. And then they conducted some hypothesis test with a small set of the cutoff values. Essentially, they want to cut the age at either 50 or 60, and also progesterone receptor levels at a limited set of cutoff values. A natural question to ask is that, is it possible that we use this clinical trial data to construct this rule in a fully data-driven way? And that's the goal of today's talk. To begin with, let's formalize the idea using mathematical notations. We will first start with a one-stage study. So we have, for each patient, a triple random variables or vectors. We have Y, which is the scalar outcome of interest, which is assumed to be the larger, the better. We have A, the treatment that the patient actually received. And we have a vector of patient ovaries at baseline denoted by X. In using this notation, we can define an individualized treatment rule as a function pi, which recommends the treatment pi of X to a patient with ovaries X. To facilitate the estimation of the individualized treatment rule, we need to introduce the causal inference framework, because we need to be able to discuss what will happen if this patient had been given treatment, another treatment. So we will make use of the potential outcome framework, which is the popular framework in causal inference. For each patient, we assume that there is a set of potential outcomes, one for each treatment option. So if there are 2 treatment options, then each patient will be associated with 2 potential outcomes. and we will make these standard assumptions when we use causal inference framework to estimate, for example, the average treatment effect. First, we assume that the consistency, which is also known as the SUVAC assumption, stable unit value assumption. That basically says that there is low interaction among the subjects. And then we assume there is low unmeasured confounder. That is, all the covariates that we measured are sufficient in the sense that the potential outcomes and the treatment that the patient actually received are conditionally independent given the patient covariates that we have in the dataset. Finally, we assume positivity, which states that for each patient in the study, they always have a positive probability that they might receive one of the treatment options. Under these standard assumptions, there is some standard way to estimate, for example, the average treatment effect for a treatment compared to the other one. But we won't be able to determine individual causal effects. Consequently, these standard assumptions are not sufficient if we want to, for each patient, determine what's the best treatment. What we are able to achieve in precision medicine is to design a rule so that if the population of interest follow that rule, the mean outcome can be maximized. So we are not aiming at giving the best treatment for each patient because that's impossible in this causal inference framework. But rather, we would consider a population quantity. That is, if we have a rule pi and we let the whole population follow this rule pi, then we can measure the mean outcome under this rule. And this is known as the value function. It is given by this formula. So essentially, it basically says that if the function pi for these patients with covariates xi, if the function pi recommends treatment A, then we would be able to see the outcome as this potential outcome yi star of A. And we will then take the average, taking the expectation. And that's the value function. And we say an individualized treatment rule is optimal if it is the one of the possible maximizer of the value function. There might be several maximizers, but we are just interested in finding just one of them. To estimate the optimal individualized treatment rule, we need to address the following two questions. The first one is that we should be able to estimate this value function v of pi using the observed data. Currently, we can see that the value function is defined using potential outcomes, which is not observable. So we need to express the value function using observed data. And then we will also need to identify the maximizer of this value function. Before going into the estimation details, let's first talk about what kind of rule we want in precision medicine. In this very early paper, Zhang and Simon proposed a rule that age is less than, if the age is less than or equal to 50 and the progesterone receptor level is less than or equal to 10, then we should give chemotherapy alone, otherwise give chemotherapy with tamoxifen. But this kind of rule is not very common in statistical literature. In a recent paper that revisited this data set, the researchers consider another type of rules. Basically, they consider a linear combination of the covariates. So they end up with getting a rule that age plus 7.98 times the log of 1 plus projection receptor level is less than or equal to 60. Linear combinations are quite common in statistics. And I've seen that there are lots of linear models. But this kind of rules can be hard to understand at a first glance. While if we draw the plot, we can see that this time the two rules here are actually quite similar. But if we have a higher dimension of covariate space, then it is no longer easy to visualize the rule in terms of if it is a linear combination of lots of covariates. And furthermore, this kind of rule are more popular in clinical practice. So that's why we would like to consider a data-driven approach to generate this kind of rules. Formally, this kind of rules can be characterized as list-based rules. And those are known as decision lists in computer science literature. So it consists of a list of if-then clauses. So if the condition C1 is met, then we recommend A1. Otherwise, if the condition C2 is met, then we recommend A2. And we will proceed going through all the if-then clauses. Finally, if the last condition is met, then we recommend the AL treatment. And if all the condition fails, then we have the last treatment that as the fourth rule option. And for the sake of interpretability, we would like to consider those conditions in the form of one of these 10 choices. So either we have, for some certain patient covariate, it is either less than or equal to some cutoff value, or it is greater than some cutoff value. Or we may want to consider two covariates simultaneously, and they could be either both of less than, or some is less than, some is greater than. And also we can either use and or to connect the two conditions. So that's all the 10 possible conditions, that the form of the conditions that we would like to put into the if clause. And for the then clause, those A's, A1, A2s, and so on are just one of the treatment options. This kind of list-based rules have several advantages. The first one is that it is readily interpretable. So it provides quite straightforward interpretation for future research. And it is also suitable for gathering findings across several data sets. If we go with this rule, we can easily represent them, for example, using a diagram. And it provides the covariates of interest, and also that is relevant for treatment recommendation and also the cutoff values. So it defines a subgroup quite clearly, and we may be able to generate further research hypotheses to investigate whether this really makes sense, either in statistical or clinical sense. And if we have several data sets, we could generate several diagrams like this, and then we could compare and synthesize them. So this kind of rules provides us with a interpretable options for treatment recommendation. While list-based rules looks a little bit restrictive, but it is still quite flexible in the sense that it includes two kinds of the most popular rules in practice. For example, if we have a rule like this, if treatment A, if at least one of the following conditions is met, then we could write it as a decision list. Basically, we say if the first condition is met, then we recommend treatment A. Otherwise, if the second condition is met, then we recommend treatment A, and so on. Finally, if all the conditions fails, then we recommend treatment B. If we have another also quite popular rule, diff treatment A if and only if all the conditions are met. Then we could consider the laudation of this statement. Basically, it says that we will recommend treatment B if one of the conditions is not met. So basically, if C1 is not met, then we recommend treatment B. If C2 is not met, we recommend treatment B, and so on. If all the conditions are met, then we go to the last clause, which says that we recommend treatment A. A further attractive property for this list-based rule is that it provides a cost-effective rule in terms of implementing the rule in practice. For example, if we have a rule like this, if x2 is greater than 7, then recommend treatment A. Otherwise, if x1 is less than or equal to 4 and x2 is greater than 5, then recommend treatment A. Otherwise, we recommend treatment B. Then when we implement this rule, at the first stage, we only need x2. So we don't need the measurement for x1 if x2 is already greater than 7. So we can short-circuit the recommendation. If x1 is some costly measurement, for example, required lab test, but x2 is just some demographic feature, then this kind of rule will be more attractive compared to a linear combination involving all the covariates. Because if we have a rule that depends on a linear combination of the covariates, then every time when we implement the rule, we have to measure all the covariates before we are able to calculate the value of this linear combination. And there is one little issue with this kind of rules in terms of uniqueness. So it is possible that there are two individualized treatment rules that they actually reduce to the same recommendation, but they can be formulated in two different forms. For example, in this figure, we could either say that we first recommend A1 to all the patients with X1 being greater than tau 1. And then we will move to this rectangle, which is for the rest of patients, we recommend A2 to patients with X2 being greater than tau 2. And then we move to the bottom left rectangle. For all other patients, we recommend A0. On the other hand, we could start with A2, the top left rectangle. So basically, if x1 is less than or equal to tau 1 and x2 is greater than tau 2, we recommend A2. And then we move to the right rectangle. If x1 is greater than tau 1, then we recommend A1. And then we move to the bottom left rectangle for A0. And if we want to analyze the properties, the statistical properties of the procedure, we could basically define these two rules as equivalent because they give the same recommendation for every possible covariate values. But if we consider the implementation of the rule, then we might prefer pi1 because if we write it in this way, then in the first stage, we only need x1. We don't need x2. But if we write it in this form, then we need both x1 and x2 for the first clause. After talking about the form of the rules that we want to build in for the problem, then I will proceed to the estimation of the optimal individualized treatment rules. As I discussed when I introduced the framework, I will need to address two questions. The first one is that I will need to estimate the value function. The value function is defined using potential outcomes, which for every patient, we only observe one of the several potential outcomes. So we need to estimate the value function using observed data. And then we will also need to find out the maximizer of the value function. Now let's first talk about the estimation of the value function. And the estimation follows quite closely for estimating the average treatment effect. Essentially, we will need to express the value function in terms of the observable quantities. If we are confident that we are able to build a nice model for how the outcome of interest might depend on the patient tolerance and the treatment received, then we could build this outcome regression model, which is just the expectation of the outcome given patient tolerance and treatment. And after we estimate this outcome regression model, if yi is continuous, then we will probably go with a linear regression. If yi is binary, then we could go with a logistic regression. And for general, we could also consider other non-parametric options or generalized linear models. After we build this outcome regression model, then we could write this value function, estimate this value function in terms of the outcome regression model. Intuitively, that basically says that if our pi recommends for a patient with tolerant xi, it recommends treatment A, then we predict the outcome would be 2 hat of xi and A. So we will take the average over all the subjects in the study. And this is an estimate of this value function. And this approach is known as two-learning in the precision medicine literature. This approach requires a theoretically specified model for the outcome regression model, which means that we need to understand the disease mechanism quite well. We need to know how the patient tolerance and the treatment might affect the outcome of interest. For many of the disease, we don't know that much about the disease mechanism. But many of the times, we really know how the physician assigns treatments based on the patient characteristics. And in these situations, we could consider a inverse probability weighting estimator based on a propensity store model. Mathematically, the propensity store is the probability that for a patient with tolerant X, what's the probability that they receive the treatment A. And then we can inverse weight the outcome of interest using the propensity store. And that's one of the quite common approach in causal inference. And for this estimator, we don't need to build any model for the disease mechanism. All we need is for the treatment assignment mechanism. We need to build a model for how patients might receive, what's the probability that the patient receive treatment A. If we have a randomized study, then this task is quite straightforward because we can estimate the randomization probability just using the sample proportion of the treatment in this data set. And there is also the doubly robust estimator, which tries to combine the benefits of the both approaches, the outcome regression model and the propensity store model. And it is not doubly robust because either the outcome regression model or the propensity store model is theoretically specified. Then we will get a consistent estimate of this value function. If both models are theoretically specified, then we can show that this estimate achieves asymptotically the smallest possible variance. That's how we estimate the value function, which is the mean outcome if all the patients in the population of interest follow the recommendation given by pi. Then the last step is to find the maximizer of the value function. And this is often a tricky task If we go with a linear rule, a linear combination, then that's typically easier. But if we go with a list that we want because we want interpretability, then finding the global maximizer, finding global maximizer of our estimated value function among the class of all the decision lists is computationally expensive. We have to essentially do a brute force search. There might be some opportunities for optimization, but that still requires an exponential time complexity. Based on the structure of the decision list, we suggest a clause-by-clause optimization. That is, we would like to first estimate the first condition and the first treatment, and then fix those, and then proceed to the second condition and the second treatment, and so on. So this idea is quite similar to the classification and regression tree. A major difference is that in classification and regression tree, we have the labels, we have the response. So we basically want to reducing the load impurity. And this is often known as supervised learning in the machine learning literature. On the other hand, I also remember that in the first talk in this series, the speaker introduced the concept of reinforcement learning, and finding the optimal rule is an example of reinforcement learning. While we want to build a rule that for this kind of patient, we recommend this treatment, for the other kind of patient, we recommend another treatment. But for all the patients, in the data set, we don't have the best treatment information in the data set. So we don't know, we don't have the best treatment so that we can build for example, a classification model. But rather, by estimating the value function, by maximizing the value function, we are actually maximizing the treatment benefit. In the data set, we have information saying that if for this patient, if we give treatment A, we observe this outcome. For the other patients, they receive another treatment and observe another outcome. So we have those indirect information about the treatment performance, and we need to make use of those to build the individualized treatment rule. And so that's an example of reinforcement learning, and that's a major difference between this work that I talked about today and the classification and regression tree. And we also introduced several tricks to basically, under certain conditions, we are able to obtain the global maximizer, and also we might be able to reduce the computational time to an acceptable amount, essentially up to a log factor, and this factor based on the number of treatment options. So essentially, the time complexity of constructing a list is the same as running a least squares with n observations and p covariates. And the algorithm is implemented in this package list-CTR, which is available on Secret. The methodology that I just described is for a one-stage study. I would also like to briefly discuss about how we can extend the methodology to multiple decisions. So I will use a two-stage study as illustration. In a two-stage study, we'll first observe the covariates at the beginning of the first stage, and then we observe the treatment received by the patient at the first stage. And then we might have an intermediate outcome observed, or if we don't have intermediate outcome, then we might set it to be 0. And then we will move to the second stage, and we will measure more covariates at the beginning of the second stage, and then we will have the treatment received in the second stage, and we have the outcome after the second stage. the overall outcome can be the sum of the two intermediate outcomes, or if we only care about the final outcome, we can set the overall outcome as the final outcome. Now, if we have multiple decisions, then the individual achievement rule will consist of multiple functions. If we have two stages, then we need to make two decisions. One recommendation for the first stage achievement and the other recommendation for the second stage achievement. So we'll have two functions, pi1 and pi2. The interesting part for the multiple decisions problem is that when we are in the situation of a sequential study, then we cannot simply apply a greedy algorithm. We first estimate what the best treatment is for the first stage and then move to a second stage and so on. Because the treatment might have a long-term effect. A drug may perform very well in short terms, but may not be that good in the long term. So when we have sequential studies, then we will need to take into account of the long-term effects. So the correct or the standard way is to go from the last stage and to the first stage in a backward induction manner. This is known as the tyrannic with backward induction. In the second stage, we have all the information available. So we will it as a single stage study and treat it as a single stage and estimate the rule. Moving to the first stage, what we need to do is we need to estimate the Q function. And this Q function for the first stage is the expected outcome that we will achieve if in the future stage, that is in the second stage, we follow the best treatment, conditional on the patient tolerates at the first stage and also the treatment on the first stage. And then we will use this Q function to build a list for the first stage. And by doing in a backward induction manner and by inserting this, the best possible future outcome, given you following the best future recommendation, we are able to interpret the long-term effect into the estimation procedure. So we are able to address the limitation of a greedy algorithm. And we could also consider the inverse probability weighting approach for multi-stage studies. But based on my limited experiences, it might have several limitations. Mostly it is quite unstable because every time we need to, on average, drop half of the patients in the waiting group. So the weights can easily get very large as the number of stages increases. And also, it could be computationally expensive because if we go with this stage, we have to estimate those pi1s and pi2 jointly instead of if we go with the backward induction, we are really estimating pi2 first and then followed by pi1 in a sequential manner. I would like to also briefly talk about the statistical properties of these proposed procedures and comment a little bit about why in statistics we still might want to prefer a linear combination, not these list-based rules. We can show that if the number of tolerates, those kind of number of possible cutoffs and the treatment options are finite. The possible cutoffs being finite means that all the tolerates are either categorical or if they are continuous, we only consider a finitely many cutoff values. Then the value of the estimated rule converges to the best possible value, the highest value at the typical rule end rate. That what we typically expect in statistics. But on the other hand, if the cutoff values could be any real number, or we have a divergent number of tolerates, then we might still be able to estimate the optimal individualized treatment rule. But the converge convergence rate would be slower than root n. In comparison, if we consider a linear combination of the covariates and use that to build treatment recommendation, then typically we would achieve a root n rate. That's standard in statistics. If we have a large number of covariates, we could impose penalties, and that will still be close to a root n rate, up to a log factor of the number of covariates. For those of you who are interested in the precise statement, I have the reference for my work in the end of the talk. The final part of the talk is going back to this motivating example and see how these proposed methods work for this breast cancer clinical trial. To briefly recall the important aspects of these trials, so we have two treatments available after surgery, either chemotherapy alone or chemotherapy with tamoxifen. And we want to tailor patient treatment recommendation based on their age with estrogen receptor level, progesterone receptor level, tumor size, and the number of histologically positive loads. And the outcome of interest is 3-year disease-free survival. And although this is a survival outcome, but in this data set, a nice feature is that we only have one censored observation. So we just remove that, and because we have more than 1,000 patients, so we believe that a single sensor observation shouldn't matter much on our results. And this is the rule estimated using the methods that I discussed previously. So out of these 5 covariates, our method successfully picks the age and progesterone receptor level, the same as Dell and Simon's choice based on their domain knowledge. And the cutoff value is slightly different. We consider all the integers as cutoff values, and we end up with getting 51 and 3. So age is less than or equal to 51, and progesterone receptor level is less than or equal to 3. Then we recommend chemotherapy alone. Otherwise, we recommend chemotherapy with tamoxifen. And compare with the rule suggested by Dell and Simon, these two rules actually agrees quite well. They agree for 92% of the patients in this study. If we are concerned about the measurement cost, we could also equivalently write this rule in an equivalent form. Basically, we would look at the age first. Age is easy to measure. We just need to ask the patient for their age. So if age is greater than 51, then we immediately know that we should recommend chemotherapy with tamoxifen. Otherwise, we may need to take the lab test and measure the progesterone receptor level. If it is greater than 3, then we will also recommend chemotherapy with tamoxifen. And finally, if both conditions fails, then we would recommend chemotherapy alone. These two diagrams reflect the same rule, but this is more concise, and this reflects slightly less measurements. In summary, in this talk, I introduced the concept of precision medicine, and also I talked about how the list-based rules might provide the potentials to have better interpretability. On the other hand, the list-based rules, because they are discrete, they cannot be easily computed. So we need to have quite sophisticated algorithms, but I have the art package developed if in case you are interested in this kind of algorithms. And also, it also have some cost in terms of statistical properties. So it may converge slower compared to a linear rule. We have this arpeggio list DTR available on Cgram, which implements the proposed approach. And if you are interested, the title details of the method can be found in this paper, Estimation of Optimal Tumor Regimes Using List. Thank you for your listening, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Yichi. And we have plenty of time for questions. So Orestes started us off with a question earlier already. Oh, sorry. And he was asking whether the list-based rules take into account the effect of treatments that happen in or above, above or below the recommendation cutoff.
I actually don't quite understand this question. Do they take into account the effect of the treatment in, above, below the recommended cutoff?
So I can Orestes unmute himself?
Orestes, if you can clarify your question in the chat, we'll attempt to answer it.
I think this is about, I mean, the way I read it was that, so treatments, treatment suggestions that don't actually necessarily get executed, so things that are below the cutoff, are they still affecting other recommendations, right? So do we reason over things that we just about didn't recommend?
If then my answer will be low, that we will just follow that. So if we stop right here, then all the treatment recommendation won't matter. So we check the conditions one by one sequentially.
I see. But so, yeah, okay. All right, I think that makes sense. Do we have any other questions for our speaker? So one thing maybe in between while we are collecting our thoughts. So I come from a very different world, right? So I come from more traditional machine learning, and there are really these two camps, I think, right? So do you do it the stats way, or do you do it the ML way? So I'm always curious about how data hungry these methods are, right? So how much data do you need to estimate these rules effectively, and maybe also how well can you fit if you had more factors, right? So you had a relatively, as far as like in my world, machine learning, we like to have hundreds of features often. So and you said, oh, I want a few factors, I want to cover them really well and see what's going on. So can you talk a bit about the amount of data you need, or what you could do if you had 10 times as much?
Yeah, that's a nice question. Actually, in our paper published in the simulation study, we consider situations where we have 50 covariates, but only about 5 to 10 of them are relevant for treatment recommendation. And in those simulation studies, we found that this method still performs quite well. But if we really have a large number of covariates, that my recommendation would be we might want to first do some feature screening to reduce the number of covariates to a reasonable amount. And in terms of the number of observations we need, that typically we, if the outcome is continuous, then we, based on my experience, we typically a few hundreds in order to get a reasonable decision list. If we have a binary outcome of interest, for example, in this illustration, the outcome is 3-year disease-free survival, which is binary, either 0 or 1. For binary outcome, because it carries less information compared to a continuous one, so we typically would need around 1,000 observations to produce a reasonable decision list.
I see. Interesting. Cool. Thank you. Do we have any other questions? If not, I would say, oh, wait. Oh, no. Okay, so this is a brief. Do we have an Outlook slide on the next talk?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect.
Yes, here.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So next Wednesday, is that right? Yeah, that's right. We'll be hearing from Rhode Zhang on the role of collaboration in uncertainty-based referral for deep learning, and then also supervised machine learning workflows for EHRs from Dylan Malufke. All right, perfect. Unless anyone, last call for questions, still has questions for Yichi, I'd like to thank everyone and have a great evening. See you all next week.
Thanks everyone for attending.